Good evening. This is just a quick Regents review on the 1980s of doing something a little different, experimenting with Microsoft Sway, which is a little bit more mobile for me. This is a short presentation on the most important points that you need to know for the U.S. History Regent, which is, of course, next Tuesday morning, 1 week from today, in fact, June 18th. So let's get started. What you need to know about the 1980s. Just remember that the 1980s is really about the people. You really need to make sure that you understand who the leaders are and why they are so important. Remember, the 1980s, we are still in the Cold War. The Cold War is still going on. However, there's going to be a major shift that occurs. And, of course, the first president of the 1980s is none other than Mr. Oh, gosh, how can I get this right? There we go. Yes, I am experimenting with this. President Ronald Reagan. He is elected in 1980. He will take office in 1981. He is a conservative Republican from the state of California and, of course, a former Hollywood actor. The thing that makes Mr. Reagan so important is the fact that he really ushers in what is referred to as this new conservatism, I should say. That's a response to the protest culture of the 1960s and, for the most part, for the 1970s. It has been aptly dubbed the Reagan Revolution. You will have conservatives who will align themselves with him and his ideology, and it represents a resurgence of political conservatism, and that's still with us even with today's Congress. You still see it. The thing to remember about Reagan conservatism, it's also going to impact the way we deal with the Soviet Union. Remember that the Truman administration and the Truman Doctrine, the whole issue of containment, that had pretty much dominated American foreign policy decisions. Nixon's going to bring something different, as we have already discussed in class, and you'll see it in a review video for the 1970s. Nixon's approach is the détente approach. That is a relaxation of tensions. So the Nixon administration is going to go out of their way to extend olive branches or to engage in cultural exchanges, like with China and the Panda Bear and ping pong. If you've ever seen Forrest Gump with Tom Hanks, you'll see references to that in the movie. But the point of those things, however trivial they might appear, is to relax the tensions between the superpowers. Reagan is not that guy. Reagan is going to take a harder approach. He believes that communism is wrong. He believes that it is detrimental to the freedoms of people, and he believes that it must go. And so he's not going to take a conciliatory approach. He's going to take a much hardline approach than Nixon did. It's almost a return to the original Truman Doctrine that we saw in the starting with Truman himself, and then, of course, going through the LBJ's administration. And, of course, eventually, though he does not deserve all of the credit, Reagan certainly deserves some of the credit. We watched in class the famous Mr. Gorbachev tear that wall down. Okay, that one of the most famous speeches in American history, one of the most famous speeches ever made by an American president. And eventually, that wall will come down, and remember that the wall is a symbol, I should say, of the Cold War. So it's very, very important. His stance was very important, and he cannot be overlooked in terms of credit for that. Another thing that he should be remembered for is I don't know if I should say the threat of a Star Wars program. He had the idea to launch a Star Wars program, which is essentially an intergalactic surveillance program, where we would use satellite shields to deflect missiles. The funny thing is that it scared a lot of the Eastern European countries, particularly the Soviet Union, of course, into thinking that we had this technology, and so we start to see all of these treaties being placed on the table. The program itself didn't really come to much it actually does. I remember as a child being confused, thinking, are we serious? Are we actually going to make the movies a part of our foreign policy? Whatever you want to call it, it worked to some extent, because the Soviet Union certainly did make some concessions on the arms deals, which we'll talk about in another video. But what it showed is that the United States was willing to continue to pour in funds to strengthen its military might. Now, mind you, we were already one of the two superpowers. At the end of the day, we wore the Soviet Union down with our money and our might. Our technological sophistication was far beyond theirs, and there are a number of reasons why that is the case. But the fact of the matter is, we wore them down, and Reagan's ideas, albeit crazy to many, were potent enough, at least, to scare the daylights out of some of his political opponents, and certainly some other countries around the world, forcing them to change their approach to us. The IranContra scandal. This happens this is in the second term of Reagan's administration. I remember watching the hearings when I was in middle school and trying to figure out what the Mickey flick they were talking about. I had no clue who these people were. This is what I know. We did something wrong, and President Reagan said the poor thing couldn't remember. And I feel bad now because, as it turns out, the poor man probably was in the beginning stages of Alzheimer's, which he was eventually diagnosed with. From a political stand and for your purposes, these are the things that you need to know about the IranContra scandal, because there's several issues that I think are germane to your studies, and certainly germane to your approach should you see this question on a region or any issue on the region attached to it. What happened is that we got caught trading weapons for hostages. The weapons, if I remember correctly, were then sold for profits, and then the money that we got then went to fund an anti-communist group in Nicaragua or something like that. The whole end goal was to oppose communism. So again, we see this stance of we must stop communism from spreading. This is the strong stand against communism that we spoke about earlier. You also see in the maneuvering, whether Reagan was a part of it or not, you see the issue of checks and balances. This is why you need to know the Constitution. You need to know the structure of our government and how it works. Congress had absolutely said, no, we will not sign off on any law or any provision where we are sending money to these groups who are trying to overthrow governments. We're not going to do it. We don't want any part of that. The Reagan administration, or parties connected to the Reagan administration, got around that by secretly pulling off this trade of weapons for hostages. So you see, even though it was definitely not on the up and up, it was a way for the executive branch to sidestep the checks and balances structure of the Constitution. And of course, there's a big scandal. Some people lose their jobs. I can't remember if anyone went to prison, but that's the first time you hear the name Oliver North. Oliver North currently, I do believe, is the president of the NRA. He may have announced his retirement. I can't remember for sure, but he definitely is connected to the NRA at this point. One thing to point out, a lot of people, especially a lot of liberals, tried to make this or turn this scandal into the new Watergate, and it certainly was not Watergate. For a number of reasons that I won't go into. But again, you see this adversarial nature between the White House and the media. And then, of course, politicians and the media in general. There's this distrust that continues to grow. And you will see that manifest even more in the coming administrations. Okay, please do not think that I am bashing or hating on George H.W. Bush. I absolutely love this man, to be honest with you. He is the father of the future president, George W. Bush. He's a Republican. He also was Reagan's vice president. He's going to continue the war on drugs that the Reagan administration pushed. This is where you get the 3 strikes and you're out rulings, where you basically are placing people who are dealing drugs, throwing drugs. Basically, if they're committing crimes for whatever reasons, and especially if it's related to drugs, they're going to prison. Okay? I put Willie Horton up there. I don't really feel like talking about him, but on your own, you should Google that name or go on YouTube and type in Willie Horton and George H.W. Bush, because it showed how presidential campaigns can get very slimy when you have people who will take cases and then use them for their own political advantage. It was actually one of the most highly controversial political commercials probably in American campaign history. People accused it of being racist. I forget. I think it was Michael Dukakis. Michael Dukakis ran against George H.W. Bush for president, and basically George H.W. Bush's camp, particularly Lee Atwater, ran with this whole idea of, if you elect Dukakis, he's going to let these crazy criminals out on furlough, and then they're going to go out and commit horrific crimes, which allegedly is what Willie Horton did in fact do while he was out on furlough. He went out and committed another deadly crime. And so that was used. The thing to remember about George H.W. Bush, besides the read my lips, no new taxes, is that he is really known for the Persian Gulf War and Operation Desert Storm, where we are sending troops into the Middle East to battle Saddam Hussein. This is a portend of things to come. The first time we went, we were there to protect the oil fields. We said that we were going to go to war to protect those oil fields. Saudi Arabia is our ally. And on top of that, we had Kurdish residents who were claiming that they were being oppressed. I'm putting both of these conflicts together. Who claimed that they were being oppressed by Saddam Hussein. And they certainly were. There certainly were human rights violations. So we're going to go in there. And the war does not, and I say war in quote marks, it doesn't last very long. He backs off. Saddam Hussein backs off. The oil wells are free and clear again. But one of the issues that's left over is that Saddam Hussein is still in power. And even some of his closest advisors were upset. They wanted Hussein dead. They wanted him out of power. President Bush at the time, President Bush Sr., I should say, did not want that. He believed that that was not the mission. Mission accomplished was what he had laid out, and he stuck to it. But you will have those in his camp who will feel like this is unfinished business. You need to keep that in mind, because that business is going to get finished years down the road. What we see burgeoning here in the late 1980s and, of course, at the beginning of the 1990s, it's going to set the tone for the policies that we have now. We see a direct conflict between American forces and those who are aligned with terrorists or suspected of being aligned with terrorists. And this is really setting the tone for the next 30 years of American foreign policy. So, Regent Keys, listen, I've only covered 2 presidents. I wanted to put Carter in here, but Carter was not reelected. He's in the 70s video slide. If you remember nothing else about the 80s, the Regents will tend to ask questions about Reagan's economic ideas, often referred to as Reaganomics. I'm putting 3 different names here, just in case you see one of them. Reaganomics equals supply-side economics, which equals trickle-down economics. And all it means is this. If we provide tax incentives or tax breaks for the wealthy, for the wealthy, particularly business owners, for the small business owners, they will make more money. And if they make more money, then they will be able to provide more raises. If they provide more raises, then workers will have more money to spend. And if workers spend more money, then the economy grows. Side note, that didn't really happen much. And we wound up in a tough economic situation. And then, of course, I just talked about the Persian Gulf War and why it's important. keep that in mind. Video next.